They weren't generals. They didn't carry swords, yet their presence could clear an entire village, ignite mobs, and send even noblemen trembling to the pulpit. These were not warriors. These were women accused of consorting with the devil. In a time when war was routine, death expected, and bloodshed normalized, another fear gripped the medieval world tighter: witches. What made them more terrifying than invading armies? What power did society believe they held? And why did that fear persist for centuries? In times of war, fear has a face: soldiers on horseback, the clash of steel, villages set ablaze. It's loud, visible, and immediate. But the fear that followed accusations of witchcraft moved silently. No banners, no battle cries, only whispers, glances, and a tightening sense that something was wrong. Across early modern Europe, from the 15th to the 18th century, people lived in a constant state of low-grade terror, not of soldiers, but of neighbors. The psychology of fear works differently when the threat is invisible. A sword can be blocked. An army can be fled. But how do you fight a hex? How do you defend against a glance, a muttered word, or a bad harvest that someone claims was caused by your midwife? This kind of fear doesn't need to be proven. It spreads through suspicion, not strategy. It gains strength not from facts, but from the absence of them. War is political. Witchcraft is personal. The soldier threatens your body. The witch threatens your soul, your crops, your child's health, your cattle. When the unknown becomes the explanation for suffering, witchcraft becomes not just possible but probable. That's what made it terrifying. People turned to supernatural causes when natural ones weren't understood. And in a time before germ theory, before meteorology, before modern medicine, fear filled every gap in knowledge. Communities under pressure were especially vulnerable. A failed harvest, a brutal winter, a plague, these were often blamed not on poor soil, weather patterns, or rodents, but on malice. Someone had caused it. The idea that human suffering had a human source gave people a false sense of control. If a witch could be found and punished, perhaps the sickness would end. Perhaps the cattle would stop dying. It didn't matter if the link was real. The need for answers was stronger than the need for truth. This wasn't limited to rural superstition. Educated men in courts, universities, and churches believed in the devil's influence. Theologians debated the mechanisms of possession and pact. Legal codes were updated to include maleficium, harm caused by magical means. Even monarchs took part. King James VI of Scotland personally supervised witch trials and later authored Demonology, a text that justified persecution. Fear also served authority. Rulers and clergy understood that invisible threats created dependency. If people believed evil could lurk in the soul of a poor widow, they would cling more tightly to the church, to the courts, to the crown. Fear of witches was more than paranoia. It was policy. Unlike war, which came and went, the fear of witches was ambient. It was part of everyday life. And unlike soldiers, who could be seen and named, witches were suspected, not confirmed. That uncertainty made them more dangerous in the public imagination. Because if anyone could be a witch, then no one was safe. Understanding this fear is not just a matter of studying belief. It's a study of control, of uncertainty, and of the human need to explain what hurts us. In that need, the witch unseen, unknowable, and unprovable found her place. Across medieval and early modern Europe, life was framed by scarcity, suffering, and uncertainty. Most people were peasants bound to the land, illiterate, and wholly dependent on nature for survival. A bad harvest could mean starvation. A sudden frost, or weeks without rain, wasn't just inconvenient, it was existential. There were no welfare systems, no scientific explanations, and very little margin for error. Plague struck in cycles. The Black Death killed an estimated 25 million people in Europe between 1347 and 1351. But that wasn't the end. Recurrences followed. 1361, 1374, 1400. Entire families would vanish in days. People buried their loved ones without priests. In towns like Florence and London, carts hauled away corpses as if they were waste. This wasn't a rare catastrophe, it was routine. Death from disease, famine, or war was part of the rhythm of life. Yet in the middle of all this suffering, another fear thrived: witchcraft. People feared hexes, charms, maleficium, the use of supernatural power to harm others. Even as they faced very real threats from warlords, epidemics, and hunger, they still turned to scapegoats who were said to poison wells, blight crops, and summon storms. This wasn't irrational in their worldview. There was no germ theory, no meteorology, no concept of bacteria or viral transmission. A cow dying suddenly, a child wasting away, or a wife becoming barren could be interpreted as spiritual attacks. If prayer failed, and if penance did not ease the suffering, then attention turned elsewhere. Suspicion became a tool of survival. This way of thinking wasn't confined to remote villages. City councils passed ordinances against fortune and healers. In Basel, in 1481, a woman named Steiner was arrested for allegedly spreading the plague by magical means. In Geneva, the city council ordered a crackdown on suspected witches in 1572, just as a devastating outbreak of disease swept the area. The correlation between panic and persecution was no coincidence. Social tensions often fueled accusations. A beggar denied food, a midwife whose patient died, a widow who lived alone. People on the margins of society, those with no strong male relatives, no patrons, no property, were the most vulnerable. It didn't take much for misfortune to be tied to someone's presence, words, or even a glance. These fears weren't just spiritual. They were social mechanisms, ways to make sense of disorder and to assign blame. Even within the household, danger was constant. Infant mortality was staggering. In some regions, only half of all children survived past the age of 5. Women risked death in childbirth. Small injuries could turn fatal. And yet, instead of attributing these tragedies purely to chance or nature, many believed unseen forces were at work. Witches didn't replace war or disease as threats. They explained them when no one could stop the plague. People still believed they could stop a witch. This climate of constant risk created the perfect soil for witchcraft fears to grow. In a world where danger was inescapable, the idea of someone choosing to bring harm secretly, deliberately, was more terrifying than the chaos of nature or the brutality of soldiers. The witch, unlike death or famine, had intent that made her even more dangerous. By the late Middle Ages, the image of the witch was no longer just a local healer or village eccentric. She had become, in the eyes of the Church, a threat to the entire Christian order, not merely a sinner, but an agent of Satan himself. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was the result of centuries of doctrine, fear, and power converging, and it focused with disturbing consistency on one figure: the independent woman. Christian theology in medieval Europe was shaped heavily by the writings of early church fathers, Augustine, Jerome, and later Thomas Aquinas. These men, interpreting scripture through a Roman and patriarchal lens, reinforced the belief that women were spiritually weaker, more easily deceived, and more prone to temptation. The story of Eve was central. In Genesis, it was the woman who was deceived by the serpent, who then led the man into sin. This narrative wasn't just theological, it was institutional. Women were seen not only as subordinate, but as spiritually volatile. As the Church solidified its power across Europe, it began constructing a theology in which deviation from Church norms, especially by women, was not only disobedience, but demonic. Heresy, sexual independence, medical knowledge, and even assertiveness could be interpreted as signs of spiritual corruption. Monasteries taught that the devil targeted women first. Confessors were instructed to look for signs of witchcraft in women who were sexually active outside marriage, who lived alone, or who practiced folk healing. The Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor, codified these ideas with brutal clarity. It argued that women were more likely to be witches because they were more credulous and more impressionable. It cited their supposed insatiable carnal desires and claimed that once corrupted, they used their sexuality to lure men into sin and heresy. Kramer's text wasn't fringe, it was adopted widely across Europe, reprinted dozens of times, and used by both secular and ecclesiastical courts to justify executions. In this framework, witchcraft became a form of rebellion against divine authority. A woman who claimed spiritual power outside the Church, whether through healing, divination, or midwifery, was not just suspicious, she was subversive. The Church, already engaged in power struggles against rising state authority and internal heretical movements, used witchcraft as a way to reassert dominance. It painted witches not as misguided souls, but as willful traitors in league with the enemy of all Christians, the devil. Accusations were rarely just about magic. They were about control. The targets were disproportionately women who had no male protection, widows, spinsters, orphans. In Germany, where some of the worst witch hunts occurred, 82% of those accused were women. In Salem, Massachusetts, the Panic of 1692 echoed the same pattern. Most of the accused were women whose lives challenged the accepted norms. The Church's teachings merged with legal codes, superstition, and social resentment to form a structure that policed female autonomy under the guise of rooting out evil. A woman who owned land, spoke too freely, or rejected marriage could be recast as a servant of Satan. Her body was no longer, on it was evidence, a site of suspicion, a potential gateway for demonic influence. By labeling witches as rebels against God's hierarchy, the Church gave spiritual license to persecution. It wasn't just justice, it was salvation. Burning a witch didn't just remove a threat. It reaffirmed the world's order, an order where the Church was supreme, men led, and women obeyed. Any deviation from that was not simply wrong, it was evil. In the aftermath of war, Europe often turned inward. When the soldiers laid down their weapons, another kind of violence took their place, one that didn't involve armies or battlefields. It targeted the old, the poor, the strange, and most often, the powerless. Nowhere was this more visible than in the German-speaking lands following the 30 Years' War. The conflict, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, devastated Central Europe. Entire regions were burned, looted, or depopulated. Some estimates suggest that up to 40% of the population in parts of the Holy Roman Empire perished due to war, famine, and disease. But when the Treaty of Westphalia finally ended the fighting, peace didn't bring relief, brought accusation. In the decades immediately following the war, the most brutal witch persecutions in European history erupted. The town of Wurzburg, between 1626 and 1631, executed hundreds. In nearby Bamberg, the Prince Bishop Johann Georg II Fuchs von Dorn launched a massive purge. At least 600 people were killed for witchcraft between 1626 and 1631. Trials resumed and intensified even after military campaigns had ceased. These weren't random outbreaks. They followed a pattern. Regions hit hardest by war, famine, and plague saw the most intense witch hunts. In the chaos of war, people had no time to look inward. But once the dust settled, communities demanded explanations for their suffering. And when no answers came, when prayers failed, and rulers could offer no justice, they searched for enemies. Within, witchcraft, in this context, wasn't a superstition. It was a framework to explain long-term catastrophe. Villages that had lost half their population to hunger or disease didn't view that as a natural misfortune. They believed someone had caused it through curses, pacts with the devil, or malice. Cloaked in everyday life, the accused were rarely strangers. They were neighbors, relatives, or midwives. In some towns, children testified against parents. Husbands denounced wives. Social cohesion collapsed. The psychological trauma of war also reshaped public morality. Traditional hierarchies had been disrupted. Soldiers returned to communities that no longer recognized them. Women had taken on unfamiliar roles. Old customs were broken, and institutions like the church had lost credibility. In this fractured world, fear found new fuel. Witch hunts became a means of restoring moral order through elimination. Local authorities played a central role. In many cases, it wasn't the church, but secular officials who drove the trials. They set up special tribunals, built torture chambers, and paid informants. In places like Eichstätt and Ellwangen, entire municipal budgets were directed toward prosecuting witches. The longer the trials continued, the more the towns depended on the process. Confiscated property from the accused often helped fund the courts themselves. There was no consistency in these persecutions. In some towns, a single bad harvest could spark dozens of accusations. In others, nothing happened for years. What mattered most was instability. Communities traumatized by war and plagued by economic collapse were more likely to lash out. In these fragile environments, witches became the embodiment of every unsolved grief. Witch hunts, then, were not relics of the past, they were reactions to crisis. They didn't arise in isolation, but in the ruins of failed institutions, broken trust, and overwhelming loss. When the external enemy disappeared, the search for blame turned inward, and the witch, invisible and undefended, became the perfect target. In early modern Europe, witchcraft accusations didn't begin with smoke rising from a stake. They began with a glance, a murmured complaint. A rumor passed from one doorstep to another. Fear didn't need proof. It needed only a whisper. Most accused witches weren't strangers. They weren't cloaked figures in distant forests. They were women who lived down the road. A midwife who had lost one too many infants in childbirth. A widow who argued over land boundaries. A beggar denied bread who cursed in frustration. In small, tightly knit villages, social tension was constant. Every community had disputes over inheritance, grazing rights, livestock, property lines. When something went wrong, and it often did, people looked for a human cause. A well went dry. A child fell ill. A cow miscarried. If there had been conflict recently, especially with someone on the social margins, the connection was made in the town of Glarus, Switzerland, in the early 17th century. A woman named Dorothea was accused after neighbors blamed her for a series of crop failures. She had long been seen as quarrelsome and once shouted at a man whose fields later flooded. That was enough. She was arrested, tortured, and executed. No magical evidence, only memory, tension, and coincidence. Local gossip served as both fuel and evidence. Courts often treated testimony from neighbors as proof, especially when more than one person came forward. It didn't matter that their stories conflicted. What mattered was consensus real, or coerced that something unnatural had occurred. In this way, the village became both the investigator and the jury. Accusations often spread through what historians call accusatory spirals. One person was accused and under torture named others. Those others, when questioned, named more. In Würzburg, during the 1620s, this process led to the arrest of entire families. Children accused their parents. Servants implicated masters. A single charge could unravel a whole town. Economic stress made this worse. In periods of famine or disease, resentment festered. Those who survived or seemed unaffected became suspect. A woman who continued to bake bread during a poor harvest, or who kept her livestock healthy during an outbreak, could quickly become a target. Prosperity, in a time of suffering, became a mark of guilt. Jealousy played its part. In Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692, the first women accused Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne were all socially vulnerable. Tituba was an enslaved woman. Sarah Good was a beggar. Osborne had defied local norms. By attempting to claim property, their low status made them easy to isolate and accuse. Once the trials began, anyone with a grudge had an opportunity to settle it with lethal consequences. Witchcraft fears weren't imposed from above. They grew from below, fed by ordinary conflict. This made them more dangerous than external threats. Soldiers came and went. Armies were visible. But witches were imagined in the faces people already knew. The betrayal felt personal. Paranoia didn't come from evil. It came from the collapse of trust. The sense that a neighbor's smile might hide harm. That the woman who helped deliver your child could also be the one who cursed it. When a society reached that point, the question wasn't if someone would be accused. It was when. Witch trials in early modern Europe were not merely legal procedures, they were instruments of spectacle, fear, and control. Unlike military tribunals, which focused on offenses against the state and discipline within ranks, witchcraft prosecutions revolved around ideology, morality, and imagined crimes. The justice system built to handle them blurred the line between law and theater. Confession was the cornerstone. Without it, conviction was difficult. But rather than being obtained through evidence, confessions were extracted by force. Torture wasn't a last resort. It was procedure. Courts across the Holy Roman Empire, Scotland, France, and Switzerland legalized the use of torture for suspected witches, often after mere accusation. Instruments varied: thumbscrews, leg crushers, the strappado, where victims were hoisted by their arms and dropped suddenly to tear shoulder joints apart. In Bamberg, during the infamous hunts of the 1620s, the so-called witch house included specialized torture chambers, complete with built-in equipment. Suspects were shown the tools before questioning. Psychological pressure was part of the process. Once pain began, people confessed to anything. They claimed they flew to Sabbaths, murdered infants, or copulated with demons. Judges wrote it all down. Many of those interrogated were illiterate peasants. They didn't understand the theological framework of their charges, yet under duress, they parroted phrases fed to them. They signed confessions with trembling hands, or with marks if they couldn't write. These statements, made in agony, became the central evidence in nearly every major witch trial across Europe. Once guilt was secured, executions followed swiftly. Burning was the most symbolic form. The flames were said to purify the soul, though the true purpose was deterrence. In Scotland and parts of Germany, burning was standard. In England, hanging was more common. The public was often invited. In towns like Würzburg and Trier, entire marketplaces filled to watch women and men tied to stakes, surrounded by wood soaked in oil or pitch. Executioners lit the fires. Spectators prayed, cheered, or watched in silence. Unlike military justice, which punished specific violations of code, which trials targeted beliefs and identity, soldiers could be court-martialed for desertion, insubordination, or theft, but their trials were relatively quick, their sentences clear. Witch trials stretched for weeks or months. They involved interrogations, community testimony, and theological consultation. They didn't just punish the body, they condemned the soul. In Trier, between 1581 and 1593, over 350 people were executed for witchcraft. The records show how entire families were destroyed. Johannes Linden, a city official, lost his wife and daughter to accusations. He protested. He was then arrested and burned as well. The process fed on itself. The visual dimension was deliberate. Gallows and pyres were placed in central squares. Officials made speeches. Clergy recited prayers. The public learned a clear lesson: deviants, real or imagined, would be punished in full view. Children watched. Neighbors watched. Accusation became a threat, and silence became self-preservation. What made these trials more terrifying than the battlefield was their unpredictability. In war, death had rules enemies. War uniforms, battles had fronts. Witchcraft trials had none. The accused came from homes, not armies. The weapons were words, and once named, few escaped. The courtrooms, torture chambers, and execution sites of the witch craze were not just scenes of punishment. They were stages, designed to amplify fear, to broadcast power, and to make sure everyone knew exactly what would happen if they stepped out of line. In the eyes of early modern European society, the most powerless could quickly become the most dangerous. The typical witch wasn't a mysterious figure cloaked in secrecy. She was a widow, an older woman who spoke too sharply, a beggar who lingered too long at a doorstep. These women occupied the lowest rungs of the social hierarchy, and that made them both vulnerable and suspect. The demographic patterns of witchcraft accusations are clear. Historians analyzing trial records from places like Scotland, Germany, and Switzerland have found that the overwhelming majority of those accused were women. In many regions, over 75% of accused individuals were female, and among those, the most common profiles were poor, elderly, and unmarried or widowed women. In societies where marriage to a man offered legal and social protection, women without male relatives were easy targets. A widow had no husband to defend her in court. An unmarried woman had no father or brother whose status might shield her. These women often lived alone, on the outskirts of the village or in marginal housing. Their survival depended on small-scale labor, bartering, or charity any of which could arouse resentment or suspicion. The paradox was stark. These women had no political voice, no property, and no influence, yet they were believed capable of devastating harm. In Essex, England, during the 1580s, a woman named Agnes Waterhouse, known locally as Mother Waterhouse, was executed after being accused of causing illness and death through witchcraft. She was a widow, lived in poverty, and had a reputation for speaking harshly. Her trial became one of the earliest in England, where a confession included the supposed use of a familiar spirit, an animal believed to do her bidding. The fear wasn't really about magic, it was about autonomy. Women who did not conform to the ideal of quiet obedience were seen as disruptive. If they cursed after being denied food, and the granary later caught fire, it was interpreted not as coincidence, but as evidence of supernatural retribution. Their lack of power in formal structures made them safe to attack, but their perceived unpredictability made them dangerous in the imagination of their neighbors. Men were accused but far less frequently, and usually in association with women already under suspicion. And when men were tried, they were more likely to be released or acquitted. The legal system mirrored the social one. It assumed that women were more morally fragile, more susceptible to temptation, and therefore more likely to consort with the devil. Witchcraft accusations gave communities a mechanism to vent fear, grief, and social frustration onto people least able to defend themselves. In a time of plague, famine, or economic collapse, holding someone accountable offered relief, and the powerless, those already isolated, offered the least resistance. This wasn't accidental. It was structural. Witchcraft accusations didn't just reveal paranoia. They exposed the fault lines of power, and they showed how quickly justice could become a tool of fear when applied to those who had no voice, no allies, and no way out. Resistance during the witch trials was re-ran often. Fatal, but it existed. Despite torture, humiliation, and the certainty of execution, a handful of accused individuals defied their accusers, their judges, and the culture that had already marked them for death. Their defiance didn't stop the trials, but it disrupted the script. In 1591, in North Berwick, Scotland, Agnes Sampson was arrested during King James VI's infamous witch hunt. Under torture, she confessed to consorting with the devil, raising storms to sink the king's ship, and attending witches' gatherings. But when dragged into court, she recanted. In front of the king himself, she declared that her confession had been forced and was untrue. The court ignored her. She was stripped, searched for the witch's mark, tortured again, and ultimately executed. But her brief defiance was documented, and it unsettled even James, who later grew more skeptical of witch trial methods in Würzburg, Germany, where hundreds were executed in the 1620s. Maria Hull became a rare case of survival. A respected innkeeper, she was accused by neighbors and arrested in 1593. She endured 56 sessions of torture, but she refused to confess. Her case gained attention because of her resilience. Local authorities eventually released her. She had faced the same machinery of pain that had broken so many others, but held out and walked free. Others resisted in different ways. In 1630, in the Bavarian town of Eichstätt, a woman named Barbara Schwartz cursed her interrogators while under torture. The court recorded her words that God would judge them, and that her blood would be on their hands. Her execution proceeded, but her outburst entered official records. These moments of defiance, preserved in dusty archives, reveal more than anger. They reveal clarity. a refusal to endorse lies, even when death was the only alternative. In England, where torture was technically illegal without royal permission, resistance often took the form of legal defiance. In the Pendle witch trials of 1612, Elizabeth Device famously cursed the court mid-trial. She screamed that her children had been manipulated, and that the judges were murdering the innocent. She was hanged, but her voice made it into the trial record. Her daughter, Janet Device, who had testified against her, would later be tried herself in a separate wave of accusations. These weren't heroines in the modern sense. They didn't escape the stake or change the system. But their refusal to validate the process left a crack in its logic. For a society built on absolute obedience, even a single act of resistance was dangerous. It suggested that belief could be challenged, that accusations weren't always true, and that the condemned might not be monsters, but witnesses to something deeply wrong. By the 18th century, the witch hunts had largely subsided. Trials became rarer. Executions stopped. Laws that once mandated death for sorcery were quietly repealed or left unenforced. But the image of the witch didn't disappear, it changed. What had once been a figure of terror central to legal, religious, and social paranoia began to shift into folklore, then into myth, and finally into metaphor. In parts of Europe, especially rural areas, belief in witchcraft persisted well into the 19th century, but official structures abandoned it. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu ridiculed witch trials as relics of ignorance. Legal reformers dismissed them as judicial embarrassments. Science, still in its early stages, offered alternative explanations for illness, weather, and mental health, weakening the old logic of supernatural blame. Yet even as belief declined, the image of the witch remained embedded in cultural memory. In German folktales, the witch became a figure of the woods, dangerous but distant. The Grimm brothers' 1812 tale of Hansel and Gretel cast her as a cannibalistic crone luring children into her oven. In England and Scotland, old ballads and rural superstitions kept the stereotype alive. The solitary, bitter woman, armed with curses and strange herbs. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, the witch had been largely neutralized in public imagination. But the 20th century brought a transformation. During the rise of feminist movements, especially in the 1960s and 70s, and writers began to re-examine the witch hunts, not as episodes of primitive superstition, but as gendered violence. Writers like Sylvia Federici and Mary Daly argued that the European witch hunts were political axe stools used to suppress women's autonomy, especially in matters of medicine, reproduction, and property. The witch, once demonized, was reframed as a symbol of resistance. Her crimes, independence, knowledge, sexual freedom were reinterpreted as strengths that threatened patriarchal structures. This reinterpretation gave the witch a new role in the cultural imagination. She became not a villain, but an icon. In literature, film, and art, she re-emerged not as a feared outcast, but as a figure of power. The trials were no longer cautionary tales, they were seen as evidence of how societies use fear to control bodies, beliefs, and dissent. The shift reveals more than changing attitudes. It shows how cultural symbols evolve in response to power. The witch was never just a woman with a broom or a spell book. She was a mirror. In each era, her image reflected what society feared most, be it heresy, disease, female sexuality, or rebellion. Her transformation from scapegoat to symbol tells a longer story of fear, control, survival, and reinterpretation across generations. In the 21st century, witches no longer burn in marketplaces, but accusations still spread swiftly, publicly, and often without evidence. A tweet, a headline, a viral video, and just like that, someone becomes a villain. Online, reputations are dismantled in real time. And while the language has changed, the logic has not. The term witch hunt is now part of everyday vocabulary. It's used by politicians, celebrities, and pundits, sometimes accurately, often carelessly. But the reason the phrase holds power is because the mechanism it describes still resonates. Social scapegoating didn't disappear with the end of formal trials. It evolved in digital culture. Moral panics play out in compressed timelines. One controversial opinion, a misunderstood joke, or even a baseless accusation can spark a digital inquisition. Like the village whispers of the 17th century, online accusations often rely on vague claims, emotional outrage, and group consensus rather than concrete evidence. And once the crowd forms, retraction or context rarely matters. This isn't new behavior. The psychological machinery that drove early modern witch trials, fear, projection, collective guilt, and the need for social purity remains intact. During the Salem trials of 1692, children's testimonies were accepted without scrutiny. Spectral evidence, claims that someone's spirit had harmed another, was enough to justify executions. Today, the evidence may be screenshots or rumors, but the reaction is similar: fast judgment, public shaming, and little room for defense. The targets, too, follow patterns. In the 17th century, witches were often people on the margins, poor, widowed, outspoken women. Today, while anyone can be targeted, social dynamics still matter. Those without influence or protection are more likely to be ruined by a single accusation. Those with platforms often recover. The power imbalance hasn't vanished, it's been repackaged. Even institutions play familiar roles. In the past, the church and the courts sanctioned persecution. Now, corporations, universities, and media outlets sometimes react out of fear of backlash, not principle, making decisions based on optics rather than investigation. The need to be seen taking action overrides the need for clarity. What this suggests is that the witch was never just a person, it was a placeholder, a symbol of who not to be, a warning. In earlier centuries, the witch embodied religious deviance, social disorder, and feminine autonomy. Today, the label may be different: misogynist, traitor, bigot, radical, but the dynamic remains. The group identifies a threat, isolates it, and acts to neutralize it. This doesn't mean accountability is wrong, but history warns against confusing punishment with understanding. The witch hunts were built not on facts, but on fear, on the belief that silence equals guilt, and that dissent equals danger. The fires may be gone, the stakes dismantled, but the impulse to accuse, to purge, to prove virtue through condemnation still flickers. We no longer whisper witch out of superstition. Now we whisper it because we recognize the pattern, and perhaps because we see ourselves in it.